Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to synthesize complex research fast, giving you the core knowledge you need. Today we're tackling, well, a really thorny issue in ecology. How do you predict if an introduced species will just settle in quietly or become, a hugely damaging invasive species? It's a massive challenge.
It really is. And for a long time, the field trying to answer that invasion ecology has been pretty fragmented. Different groups looking at different things, often not talking the same language.
Which brings us to our source for this deep dive.
Exactly. We're digging into a paper led by Jamie T.A. Dick and colleagues titled Functional Responses Can Unify Invasion Ecology. It's a really important piece because what they argue is that this fragmentation, this lack of unity, stems from not having a universal measurable trait to compare species. And they think they found it.
Okay, so they're proposing a solution. What do they pinpoint as this unifying trait?
They argue it's something called functional responses, FRs for short. They believe this single concept can cut across all the different types of species and habitats and actually predict both success and impact.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we dive into why the field needed unifying, let's make sure we're all clear on this core idea. What exactly is a functional response? Can you break that down?
Sure. Think of it like how quickly something eats, depending on how much food is around. It's the relationship between resource availability, that could be prey for a predator, plants for an herbivore, or even nutrients for a plant, and the rate at which an individual organism actually consumes or takes up that resource.
Oh, like it's consumption speed limit.
Exactly. It's the curve showing how consumption rate changes as the resource density goes up. Does it level off quickly? Does it keep going up? That's the functional response.
Got it. So the big idea is that this speed, this rate, is the master key. But why was the field so fragmented before this? What was the core problem the authors identified?
Well, it's kind of a classic academic silo problem. A lot of the big invasion hypotheses, the theories about why invaders succeed, were developed looking mostly at plants or mostly at animals, rarely both.
Right, so a theory based on plant competition might not translate well to predicting predatory fish impacts.
Precisely. And you see this split everywhere. The paper mentions how even the big conferences struggle to bring everyone together. You've got freshwater invasion meetings, marine invasion meetings, IKIS, marine bioinvasions, often running separately.
So divided by habitat, divided by kingdom.
Yeah, exactly. And previous attempts to find a unifying principle, well, they didn't quite cut it. Take tropical pressure, basically. How many individuals get introduced?
This is logical, right? Introduce more, they're more likely to take hold.
It works as a general trend, sure. But the authors argue it lacks real predictive power when you get down to specifics. It doesn't explain why, say, 10 individuals of species A fail, but 10 individuals of species B explode. It's not mechanistic enough for reliable risk assessment in different contexts.
Okay, so the old approaches weren't sharp enough. And here's where it gets really interesting, as you mentioned, the language barrier. Different scientists basically studying the same thing but calling it different names.
That's a huge part of it. Animal ecologists, especially predator-prey folks, use the term functional response. They have specific models, Holling's disk equation, Rogers' random predator equation. Sounds complex.
And the plant people.
They're looking at how fast plants take up nutrients or water, essentially the same idea, rate of resource use relative to availability, but they call it things like resource uptake curves or resource use efficiency, RUE, or maybe nutrient responses. They often use Michaelis-Menten kinetics, which mathematically is actually very similar to the animal FR model.
So it's like physicists talking about energy using joules and chemists using calories for the same underlying concept.
Exactly. The paper's big insight is realizing, hey, wait a minute, this is the same fundamental process. Whether it's a fish eating insects, a rabbit eating grass, or a plant sucking up nitrogen, it's all about the rate of resource uptake relative to how much resource there is. It's truly universal.
And it underpins almost everything else.
Pretty much. They point out that this resource uptake rate is actually a core mechanism in, I think it was 28 out of 29 major invasion hypotheses listed in a big review by Catford and colleagues back in 2009. It's central.
So if it's so central, how do they propose actually using it to unify things? What's the method?
The key is comparative functional responses. Don't just measure the invader's FR in isolation. Measure the invader's functional response and compare it directly to a native species that does a similar job in the ecosystem, what they call a trophically analogous native species.
So compare the invader to its local counterpart? Like comparing the new player to the established one on the team.
Exactly. And when they did this, looking across loads of studies involving different invaders and natives, What did they find?
Here's where it gets really interesting. What did this comparative approach consistently reveal across diverse systems?
The finding was, frankly, striking in its consistency. The ecologically damaging invaders, the ones causing real problems, almost always showed a higher maximum consumption rate. Their functional response curve went higher. They simply processed resources faster when those resources were plentiful compared to their native counterparts.
A higher asymptote on the graph.
Precisely. And this wasn't just for, say, predatory fish. It held true across the board. Animal predators, herbivores, plants, vertebrates, invertebrates, in water, on land.
Wow. So it's not just about being good at using resources, it's about being fast. Can you give us some concrete examples they mentioned?
Sure. They cite work comparing invasive largemouth bass to the native Cape Kerper in South Africa. The bass just ate faster at high prey densities.
Okay, a fish example. What about invertebrates?
Invasive golden apple snail versus a native Chinese snail feeding on aquatic plants. Again, the invader had a higher maximum feeding rate, just chewing through the vegetation quicker.
And crucially, does it work for plants too? That's key for the unification idea.
Yes, absolutely. They highlight invasive gamba grass in Australia, a species notorious for fueling intense wildfires. Compared to native grasses, it showed a significantly higher rate of nitrogen uptake. It just grabs that key resource faster.
So faster resource use predicts higher impact, regardless of the type of organism or resource. That's powerful.
It is. And a major strength here is how this approach deals with that old problem of context dependency.
Right. The fact that an invader might thrive in one lake but fail in another, making predictions hard. How do FRs help with that?
You don't ignore the context, you build it into the experiment. So you can measure the invader's functional response under different conditions, different temperatures, different water clarity, maybe with or without a predator present that might scare the invader.
Ah, so you see how the context changes the FR curve.
Exactly. You explicitly test how things like habitat complexity or the presence of other species affect that consumption rate. The FR itself, the relationship, remains the core predictor, but you quantify how the environment modifies it. It makes prediction much more robust, even in messy, real-world situations.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's tackle a potential misunderstanding. Does a higher FR automatically mean the invader is directly outcompeting the native for food? There's a nuance here, right?
Yes, that's a critical point the authors make clear. FR studies measure consumption rate, which is linked to impact, but they don't directly measure or equate to interspecific competition in all cases.
They use the example of Gammarus pulex, that invasive little amphipod crustacean in Europe.
That's the classic case. Gammarus pulex invades and displaces the native Gammarus dubenipulticus. And yes, the invader does have a higher functional response on their shared food sources.
But that's not the whole story of the displacement.
No. The primary mechanism seems to be intra-guild predation. The invasive G. pulex actually eats the native G. dubeni. So it's predation, not just competition for the shared prey, driving the replacement.
But the higher FR is still correlated with the invader being dominant and having a high impact.
Correct. The functional response, that higher processing rate, is still the strong predictor of the invader's overall success and negative impact, even if the ultimate ecological pathway isn't simple resource competition. Think back to the gamba grass. Its high FR predicts its impact. Even though the impact is mediated through changing fire patterns, the high resource uptake fuels the high biomass, which fuels the fires.
Okay, so the mechanism holds up as a predictor even when the downstream effects are complex. Let's zoom out then if we connect this to the bigger picture. How does focusing on FRs practically help unify the field?
Well, it gives plant ecologists studying nutrient uptake and animal ecologists studying predation a common framework, a common language, even common math. They can suddenly compare results directly, analyze data similarly. You can have a conversation about the kinetics of invasion, whether you're talking about algae or lions.
Which breaks down those taxonomic and habitat silos we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It facilitates truly integrated research that just wasn't happening effectively before.
And this leads directly to the real-world application. Risk assessment. This is what managers and policymakers need.
Absolutely. The authors push hard for standardized FR testing. They argue we should be routinely measuring the comparative functional responses of species that are already invasive, species that are just starting to emerge, and even species listed as potential future threats, like those flagged under things like the EU Regulation 1143/2014.
So like a standard lab test before a species gets widely distributed.
Sort of, yeah. Run a relatively simple, standardized lab or mesocosm experiment, comparing the potential invader's consumption rate to a relevant native. It gives you a quick, objective estimate of potential impact.
And they draw a powerful comparison here, right, to biological control.
Yes, that's a really clever point. The biological control community scientists who introduce species to control pests have been using functional response and numerical response studies for decades.
To make sure the control agent eats the target pest effectively, but doesn't wipe out non-target species.
Exactly. They use it to predict efficacy and safety. So the argument is, if these methods work well for predicting the impact of beneficial introduced species, why aren't we using them systematically to predict the impact of harmful ones?
That's a very strong argument for adopting this more widely. What about the next steps? Where does the research go from here based on this paper?
Well, the FRA is about the individual's rate. To get the full picture, you need to combine that with how many individuals there are, their abundance. That's the numerical response. Combining FR and numerical response gives you the total response or total impact of the whole population.
So integrating population dynamics.
Right. And also incorporating FR results into bigger ecological models, like models of the functional niche. This would give a much richer, more mechanistic understanding of how an invader fits in or disrupts an ecosystem.
And refining the theory itself.
Definitely. Continuing to build the mechanistic understanding of impact and exploring related factors like how naive native prey are to a new predator or the role of longer-term evolutionary adaptation. Lots to dig into still.
It really does feel like a potential breakthrough, this long hunt for a silver bullet trait in invasion ecology. Maybe it was there all along in this fundamental measure of consumption rate.
It seems that way. The rate at which any organism uses resources, predator, herbivore, plant, appears to be the most consistent, measurable predictor of its potential to become a high-impact invader.
So what does this all mean for you listening? The key takeaway is that this fundamental consumption rate offers a potentially powerful objective tool. Whether you're managing conservation areas, regulating trade, or just interested in ecological stability, understanding this speed limit is crucial for identifying which species pose the greatest risk.
It shifts the focus towards a measurable biological property of the organism itself.
Which leads to a final thought. If these comparative FR tests are, as the authors suggest, relatively straightforward and feasible to standardize, how could this principle fundamentally change our approach? Could we move beyond reacting to invasions after they happen and instead proactively screen and regulate potential invaders before they even arrive, based on this core trait? Something to think about. That's all for this deep dive. Join us next time as we unpack another piece of critical research.